before I dive into the presentation, I think it's necessary to just have a little bit of context of Danish politics. Currently, we have about 18 parties in parliament. 4 of these parties are representative from Greenland and the Faroe Islands. The rest of the party, as you can see, they move from the left wing to the right wing. The Social Democrats, who used to be a left-wing party, is now more of a moderate, and generally politics have moved to the right in Denmark. And you can also see that since 2000, we've had 6 new political parties. They're all breakouts from other parties, and it's, to be honest, one big mess. We also have 3 political parties, the yellow parties here, the Danish Democrats, the Danish People's Parties, and the New Right. They're all explicitly have an anti-immigrant and anti-refugee agenda. That's basically why these parties started, and sometimes it can be difficult to identify any other politics than anti-immigration politics. And unfortunately, they have quite a lot of impact in parliament as well. So this is the Danish mess, just so that you have kind of like a context for this kind of multi-party system. During the election campaign, there's a lot of anti-immigration, anti-refugee, and anti-Muslim policies suggested. Some of them mentioned here. The idea that refugees' asylum claims must be processed in Rwanda. So we basically want every refugee who wants to enter Denmark to go to Rwanda first. Prohibit mosques from calling to Friday prayer with loudspeakers. That's from the Conservative People's Party. Make it illegal for children in schools to wear hijab. There's a lot of parties backing that. Prohibit.
So just Conservative People's Party is not extremely right wing, is that right?
They are right wing, but they are not the most right wing.
They are the classical Conservative Party.
The classical Conservative Party.
Yeah. Yes.
They just sometimes forget the liberal ideas.
Just a quick clarification. Are these what we would call in Australia micro parties, or are they also, like, in terms of the percentage of votes, are they all sort of more or less getting, I don't know, 10% or something? Or are there 2 major parties and then all these micro ones? Or?
Classically, the big party has been the Social Democrats and Venstre, the Liberal Party. But for many years, the Danish People's Party, which is one of the anti-immigration parties, has been the 3rd largest party. So that has traditionally been a quite big party. But they had some internal difficulties, so now they've kind of also migrated into other parties as well.
But the Conservative Party, that's Paul Schlüter's party back in the
Yes. The Conservative Party for many years were the prime ministers.
It's hard to say because now the polls are sort of showing that there's a lot of the new parties coming in have really actually gained quite a lot of traction. So the Conservative Party just a few weeks ago were in the race to become prime minister, and they had really good polls, and now they've been halved. Like they're only get half the number of the votes in the recent polls, so it's really hard to say exactly.
That was actually also one of the reasons for that was that one of the prime minister candidate from the Conservative Party were kind of clashing with Greenland, saying something like Greenland being Denmark's Africa.
Africa on ice.
Africa on ice, yeah. So it's racist in on so many levels. Yeah, but that's the Conservative Party. So make it illegal for children in school to wear hijab, prohibit halal meat at school events, that's the New Right, and make it possible for elderly people to reject caregivers wearing hijab. So that's just some of the suggestions. And I'm going to dive in a bit more to the last one here, because we have a comedian in Denmark. We have lots of comedians, but this comedian, he's called Michael Skyt, and every week on Facebook he gives a speech, and this speech is basically set up as if it was the Queen's New Year's speech, but he's then dissecting Danish politics, and from my perspective, he's actually one of the most accurate and precise political commentators in Denmark. And as you can see, he has 118,000 followers on Facebook, and that's actually quite a lot. It's more than some of the newspapers in Denmark. Again, remember, we only have 5.6 million people in Denmark, so it's quite a lot. But he was dissecting this idea of elderly people having to select whether or not, to choose whether or not their caregivers could wear hijab. And he's then saying, okay, it's a bit small here. The election campaign has begun, and so many stupid things happens on a daily basis that, yeah, we could just leave the camera running and I could just jump in front of the camera every time something stupid happened as a democratic dystopian reaction video. Jesus Christ. This week, the right-wing parties attempted to appear united at a shared press conference, but Morten Messerschmidt tied their shoelaces together and they all just snub around in their own ideologies. It was fucking good TV, I'm not shitting you. The topic raised was elderly citizens if they can reject caregivers wearing religious scarves. Some say yes, some say no, and then it's Tuesday, and they adopt the opposite view. It's the election campaign, and by now it resembles a game of Go Fish. Morten Messerschmidt, do we have any racist suggestion today? Yes. Okay, do we have any false? Messerschmidt clearly hadn't cleared the suggestion with the rest of them. Come on, people, let's be a serious alternative to the government. Morten, why are you dressed like a clown? And Jacob Ellemann and Alex Vanopslagh dazed and randomly supported the idea that they can choose the religion of your public servant. Seriously, mind control. Perhaps the most totalitarian I can come up with. Ellemann leaves the press conference and the spin doctor obviously slaps him, and 2 hours later he holds the opposite opinion. Messerschmidt, with his stupid suggestion, portrays all elderly people as if this is something they want. What? How many people has this problem? Seriously, fuck the arrogance of needing help to change your oxygen tank and then be like, no, you cannot do it. It must be someone else. Well, let's see how long you can hold your breath, grandpa. Messerschmidt's claims that it's about creating safety because some elderly citizens are afraid of Muslims. But Morten, could that be because your party for the last 30 years has been running a scare campaign? I'm just jamming, but if we normalize Muslims in a public debate, maybe people wouldn't be afraid. In the week to come, I would like you to consider this. We currently need 5,000 employees in public healthcare in Denmark, but in the election campaign, we are driving people away from the exact same sector. Goodbye, and God save my bare ass. In every New Year's speech, the Queen ends up by saying, God save the Queen, and he always says, God save my bare ass. So he dissects political discourses. These kind of confrontations between artists and politicians has been quite they occur often in Denmark, and I've written quite extensively about it in this book called Culture War. And this idea of a culture war was something that was launched by then Prime Minister Anders Fogh Rasmussen. He started out by saying, this is a quote from 2003, when he said, it's my opinion that to set the agenda in the debate about values changes society much more than legislative changes. And then he announced this culture war, which he directed against what he called left-wing arbiters of taste and immigrants and refugees. So in my framing of this culture war and this kind of cultural politics, I define it as affective politics. And when I talk about affective politics, I talk about, for instance, performative emotions. When Michael Skødt is saying, God save my bare ass, he invokes the Queen and what we associate with the Queen and thus what we associate with the nation. So just by saying that, God save my bare ass, he's kind of dissecting what the nation is and what it should be. It's about affective invitations to feel your way into politics, for instance, via fear or outrage. All these stupid examples like no halal meat at school events. It's so stupid, it's only about, sorry, it's not very academic to say stupid, but it's only about invoking fear. And then it's about affective intensities. Masumi talks about how affect is gearing us up towards a diminished or augmented state of being, but basically about generating this fear and generating these intensities. And then it's about affective governmentalization. It regulates which object and which affect are appropriate. That is, what kind of affects and emotions are we allowed to direct towards Muslims, for instance? Are we allowed to feel empathy or not? So governs which affects we are allowed to have. And then it's about affective boundary words. It's about negotiating the limits of participation, who can be a part of this we-ness that's the nation state. So this is kind of my framework for understanding all of this. And then I'm trying to see how different participants are engaging in that kind of affective politics. And that's why we're going to talk about art and activism. When I'm looking into theories on activism and deliberation, activism is often kind of distinguished from deliberation. Theories are saying that activism is about affect and emotion, where deliberation is about reason. Activism is about a particular interest group, where deliberation is about universal norms. Activism is about confrontation. Deliberation is about mutual exchange of reason. There's also something about activism being something that can be necessary, but in the ideal political conditions, activism is not necessary. It's also something about activism being a spectacle, deliberation being reflection, and activism is something where you're basically forced to adopt non-deliberative means. All of this is quite interesting, because when I'm looking at someone like Michael Skytt, who I consider to be an activist, I actually think that he's quite reasonable, even though he's obviously also creating a spectacle. I also consider him confrontational, but I also consider him as someone who is being very reflective. So there's something here where I think this is also something to do with how you understand activism. If you have a very narrow understanding of activism as something that's about this, basically about the state, and it's about circumventing the state, making a big, maybe even violent revolt, and then creating something new. But activism can also just be about dissent, about creating other ways of being together, and raising awareness. So I think in order to understand the relationship between activism and deliberation, we also need to understand what activism is, and that it's not just about these big, these huge revolutions. Anyway, for me, there's a lot of, I had this wonderful quote from Hans and Selle. Because all of this is obviously one of the reasons why I'm happy to be here, because I think the way that you are working with deliberation is often much more nuanced, and what you're talking about, Selle and Hans here. In your article, I really like the way that you're talking about deliberation in relation to reason, giving inclusion and reflection about non-verbal deliberation. So that's really important for my understanding. So, art activism. Art activism can work within art and cultural institutions. Here we have an artwork called Strude by Tine Sønderborg. This is the classical national suit from a small island in Denmark called Fanø, but it obviously resembles a hijab, or at least something where you're covering your face. So for her, this was a way of saying, well, covering your hair and your face is not just something that belongs to Muslims, it actually also belongs to Danish culture. And in order to understand this, I really like Rancière's quote here. He said that politic invents new forms of collective enunciation. It reframes the given by inventing new ways of making sense of the sensible. And I think that's what these kind of artworks do. And they create this ability to think contradictions. And this is one of the reasons why I think that art, even when it's still inside the art institutions, can have an impact. Then there's art activism that works outside art and cultural institutions. Here we have a very simple piece by Elmgren and Dragset. They put a mirror in front of the Little Mermaid and said the Little Mermaid usually gazed towards the sea, but she's become narcissistic and just looking at herself in the mirror. I think this is, again, something that's very reflective. And I think it draws a lot of, course, the way that he's thinking about critique as this idea of also having a critical examination of the self and one's own norms. So that's why I really love this artwork. And then art and activism can work both inside and outside cultural institutions. Here we have Janet Ehler's art performance, Whip It Good, and then again Ehler's and Levon Bell, Queen Mary, which is about Denmark's colonial past, which is not something that we talk about very often in Denmark, but now we have a sculpture, at least temporary, in the middle of Copenhagen. Oh, what happens now? Okay. Okay. Yeah. So basically, this is about repoliticization and a recontextualization of Denmark's colonial past. Then we have Tobias Rahim. He's currently the most popular musician in Denmark, like crazy popular. And he has made this song called Song to Siri. It's pretty amazing. It's in Danish, so it's my bad translation. But it goes, Siri, Siri, song to Siri, song to Siri. Why isn't Palestine on Google Maps? Why do you think Greenland is your habitat? Why isn't there an emoji with the Kurdish flag? You got a pirate flag, what's holding you back? Well-behaved Danish boys, my freedom fighters have become barcodes and algorithms. Hitler will probably be back one day, then we'll all be in boxes. Thank you, Google, USA, and our very own minister. He's extremely popular, but he's also making songs like this, where he's so critical and he's reflecting also a lot about his own heritage. And I would say that what Tobias Rahim does is making ethical spectacles. It's obviously a spectacle, but it's also something that's highly reflective, both about himself and about the nation that he's a part of. He's actually awesome. It's wonderful pop music. Yeah. Then there's art and activism that primarily aims to mobilize. This is really present on social media, especially on Instagram, where we see how people and organizations, especially NGOs, are both mobilizing, educating and calling for action. It's actually really interesting that all of the kind of art activist material I find on Instagram is where it's most educational. We have, for instance, this one. It's a highly popular profile in Denmark called Part-Time Arab, where she's educating people about what racism is, what everyday racism is, and she's also critical about the election campaign. Here we have an NGO who shows a picture of a young teacher student called Esra. And Esra is saying that the debate about immigration has become crazy. The politicians are just trying to surpass each other in being the toughest. They should rather try to surpass each other in being the most constructive. So we have all of these NGOs, we have all of these just more just ordinary people on Instagram trying to create this kind of mobilization, and they often use some sort of aesthetic measures. Here, for instance, trying to create this beautiful, very Instagrammable framework of understanding what the hijab can also be, kind of love and care between young women. So for me, all of this is pointing towards what Reestorff talks about when she talks about agnostic solidarity. He says that agnostic solidarity is neither about the sharing of the same humanity for all, nor the sharing of our own feelings toward others, but about the communication of human vulnerability as a political question of injustice that could become the object of a collective reflection, empathetic emotion and transformative action. I really like that quote. And then we have mediatized art activism. In some way, someone like Tobias Rahim is also highly mediatized. But here we have another artist. He's again highly popular. He's called Vafande. And at a concert where the former leader of the Danish People's Party attended, he was saying, Pia, you cannot send us home, breaking it down so that you can keep up. Yeah, what's your problem? The country is made fragile by all these lies. I'm fighting for a brown-eyed Denmark. And then Pia Kjærsgaard becomes grumpy. And he says, I will not accept this kind of behavior at a concert. No one objected. I really thought we had moved on. And he's also the same politician who says, artists must stop believing that they can be artists and left-wing politicians. Stick to art and I'll do what I can for you on the political arena. Just this very narrow idea of what politics is. And she's the one who's conducting politics, and artists should just shut up, especially if they're talking about brown eyes. Yeah. So for me, what he's doing, he knows this will generate attention. So this is basically about mobilizing a public by predicating attention. This is from The Guardian. The former prime minister depicted as a Nazi holding a pig. It's offensive to compare us to Nazis. Yeah, I'm going to skip this one and then skip to the end. Because I think for me, all of these examples show that you can consider activism deliberative. Just have to consider how you think about activism. So for me, art activist deliberation is about when art and activism addresses affective and cognitive modes of being. It visualizes new realities, counter-narratives, and publics. It reframes and repoliticizes the given and allows for the thinking of contradictions. It critically examines the self, norms, and way of being, and it mobilizes ethical spectacles by predicating attention. And then, most importantly, I think it advocates for an agnostic solidarity. And that's, for me, activist deliberation. So thank you.